Hello, welcome to History in Lowell. My name is Maritza Grooms. I'm here with my personal professor and buddy, Bob Forrant. How you doing, Bob?
I'm good. How are you? We're living in crazy times.
We certainly are. Bob, have you ever lived in precedented times?
No, I was actually thinking about it the other day before my class at UMass Lowell, and I said when the class started, I said I always assume like crazy things will happen in the history of the country and whatever, and like things never go exactly as we might think they would, but this is beyond what I figured. So yeah, I in some ways I envy the historians of 50 years from now who can like try to figure out how to make sense out of this, and like the fun that they're going to have trying to think what were they thinking.
I wonder if you would call this, what we're in today, a constitutional crisis.
In the sort of structure of the federal government where we have three branches, right? The judicial, executive, and the legislative. The judicial is supposed to sort of stand in the doorway and say, no, you can't do that.
You're right.
And at least for now, they are. But the they now are in the lower courts, not the Supreme Court. And so because the Supreme Court of the United States has become so much more overtly political, it's difficult to say on a lot of the cases that are going to work their way through. And I think that what's happening, and this is probably going to happen more and more as a consequence of what the current president is doing, is that future presidents are going to just say, I'm going to do what I want to do and go ahead and try to stop me.
Yep.
And test, right? And so if you have a favorable enough court, you can rewrite history by pushing something to the point that it makes it to the court, and then a decision gets made that like completely baffles people. And so Roe v. Wade is one of those kinds of cases in terms of that seemingly being settled history, and then it being flipped, right? So the big one now in the news is birthright citizenship, and that's sort of where that's a troubling case as it's going to work its way forward.
So before we dig in to this topic, I want to quote, I think she's a Congresswoman, Jasmine Crockett. She's been one of the loudest voices right now that I've been following, and she said $100 billion is what undocumented people in the U.S. contribute to our economy.
Yep.
They pay into Social Security, but they never get to see it.
They pay into unemployment insurance.
They pay into unemployment insurance.
State taxes.
Yep. So they are vital to all of these things that they're telling us they're not vital to. But we also know on a very local level that people, whether you're documented or undocumented, contribute to the society and make it better at large. So, Bob, let's dig in. Talking about birthright citizenship.
Okay, and we should mention in the context of this that February 14th, Frederick Douglass assumed would be his birthday.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, and so this is Frederick Douglass's birthday.
Wow.
And he didn't exactly know his birth date because he was born into slavery. He was an enslaved person. But when he escaped, he wanted a birthday. And so he chose February 14th, which is why decades ago, black historian by the name of Carter Woodson decided that this week, then it became a month, and who knows what's going to happen now. But anyway, picked this week in February that was around Frederick Douglass's February 14th birthday to be the origin of Black History Week, then Black History Month. So it's interesting that we're talking about this. So for folks that don't know, when the country's founded, when we have the Constitution and everything gets rolling, what's written into the Constitution is that black persons can never become citizens. Citizenship goes to white people, and it says that, plain and clear. But you also have, as the 19th century progresses, several 100,000 free blacks, some who have been able to purchase their freedom, others who have been granted their freedom by an owner or people who came from Caribbean islands or whatever and came in as free black people. And so their status is not defined. So how do they relate to the courts? How do they relate to law?
Yeah. What rights do they have?
Right. Do they have any right to sue? Do they have any right in court if something happens to them?
Right.
All sorts of things. And this is complicated still further. In 1857, there's a famous Supreme Court case, going back to where we started, called the Dred Scott case, where Dred Scott and his wife have lived in free parts of the United States. And the Missouri Compromise and the Kansas-Nebraska Act say, basically, if you reside in these places, then you're free.
Wow.
And this is appealed. And the Supreme Court in the Dred Scott case rules no. The courts don't, the courts that made those decisions and the federal law that made those decisions, the Missouri Compromise, Kansas-Nebraska Act, we're going in the weeds of American history here, that there was no legitimate right to change status because that status was written into the Constitution. And so in the Dred Scott case, the Supreme Court says by a vote, I think of 6 to 2, or 6 to 2, I think, but very lopsided, that Dred Scott is not free. And that becomes one of the flashpoints that ultimately leads to the Civil War. Because people say, wait a minute, if that's not the case, if states don't have that right to say these people in my state are free, then that means that every new state that comes in
and decide.
And they can't even decide. They don't even have a right to decide.
They don't have a right to decide.
Slavery can exist wherever it exists.
Oh my gosh. Like in Texas, where it was written to that state's constitution.
Right. There you go. And so, exactly. And so that becomes one of these issues as the Civil War, as we get closer and closer to the war. The war ends with the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which ends slavery. But now you have, besides the 50,000 to 750,000 people who were previously free, you now have somewhere between 8 and 10 million people who have no status and standing in American society either because of Dred Scott and everything else that's happened before. So who are they?
Who are they?
What are they? And so the Congress basically says we need another amendment to the Constitution, and they pass the 14th Amendment. It gets ratified in both houses of Congress, and it goes to the states. And they say that states that left the Union, states in the Confederacy, cannot rejoin the Union until they ratify the 14th Amendment. And this is what the 14th Amendment says. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Clear language.
Very clear.
Very clear. And again, it basically says in so many words, if you're, because otherwise, again, you have like somewhere between 8 and 10 million people that have no standing in the courts, nothing, right? So passed, ratified, then the argument about voting and other things happens. And if we jump the history a little bit, toward the end of the 19th century, there's a Chinese man, Wang Ark is his name, and he's born here. He goes to China to visit his family, and when he comes back, they won't let him in. They say he's not a citizen. He doesn't have any right to come back into the United States. And so he appeals, and this works its way through the courts. And the Supreme Court rules, I think in this one it was like 8 to 2 or 7-2 or something like. But again, lopsided the other way. So Dred Scott is one way. This one's exactly the other way, and it basically says no. The 14th Amendment's the 14th Amendment's the 14th Amendment.
And that's it.
He's a citizen. He was born here.
Right.
Sorry,
It's
he's
in
a
the
citizen.
Constitution.
Let him in.
Yes.
And that then is settled law.
Mm-hmm.
And it's been settled law until now. And now what the President of the United States is saying by executive order is, yeah, we're not doing that anymore. And the problem with that is he can't do that. He maybe thinks he can, and maybe the lawyers around him actually didn't go to law school and didn't read the Constitution and how you amend it, but he can't abrogate a portion of the Constitution because he feels like it.
Right. There's a system of checks and balances, which is why we established our government in the way that we did.
We think.
We think.
Yep.
We hope.
Dred Scott's wife, by the way, his name is Harriet. I don't want her to be anonymous. But it should have been Dred and Harriet Scott, not Dred Scott, actually, in terms of.
Wow.
So they're both appealing. They're both part of that legal case.
Maybe a few months ago we would say they are citizens, but today it's being challenged. So, Bob,
Yep.
how are we in this mess? And it impacts so many different groups of people. What is happening?
The first Donald Trump administration raised this, but never actually pushed it. They kept saying they were going to do something, and they never did. The argument that they're making now is an argument against immigrants, basically.
Mm-hmm.
Because there are millions of people, kids of immigrants who've come here, who are born here, and if they're not documented, if the parents are not documented, what Trump wants to say is the Constitution doesn't apply, and it doesn't apply to them in any way, shape, or form, and that he's actually almost going back to Dred Scott in a way of saying they have no standing.
So 200 years ago.
Yeah, they have no standing in the court system, in the legal system, and because they have no standing, the 14th Amendment doesn't apply when their children are born here. And he keeps making this derogatory and saying that women are coming here like 8.5 months pregnant so that they can get across the border and have a baby.
Anchor babies.
Yeah, and he's using this real derogatory term, right? And people who have done the research and collected the data think that of the several million people that this now impacts, maybe 2%.
Wow.
Were born like in close proximity to when people came. For the most part, babies are born. The people that we're talking about were born 1, 2, and 3 years after their family was already here.
Can you imagine that, being born here, being raised here, contributing to society here, and then somebody telling you, you need to go back to the land of your forefathers? Where would you have to go, Bob? Italy?
Well, I would have to. I could go to Ireland, I could go to Italy, or I could go to Quebec.
So
all three places
easy,
might
right?
be. Well, there could be 3 nice places to retire to. But the thing of it is, right, that in many instances that it's the idea with this is if the Trump administration were successful, then it would mean that hundreds of thousands of people would be put back in a place that they never lived in, that in many instances they probably never visited.
Mm-hmm.
They more than likely didn't learn the language.
Right.
And basically they've been here for 20 years, 18 years, 15 years. Migration Policy Institute estimates 2019 there's about 5 to 5.5 million American-born children under 18 living with a parent who is undocumented. Only about 5%, so that's about 5% of all kids in the United States. So a tiny number of total. Studies found that a vast majority of those kids did not cross the border with a mom who was pregnant. The Pew Research Center estimated in 2022 that 5 out of 6 U.S. children of unauthorized immigrants were born 2 years or more after their parents. So it doesn't even if you subscribe to this in some way, it's wrong, right?
Yeah.
But that's never stopped. That's never stopped people before.
Yep.
Then there was a case in the 1980s where the state of Texas passed a law that the children of undocumented parents didn't have a right to public education. That public money couldn't be spent on those kids. And that case was also decided by the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said no, based on the 14th Amendment, they're citizens, and they're entitled to all the rights and protections that the Supreme Court, that the 14th Amendment says they're entitled to. And so that was a closer vote. That Supreme Court vote was 5-4.
Wow. And that was in the 80s?
Yeah.
Wow. And that feels eerily relevant to a couple of episodes ago when we were talking about children here who were just trying to get an education,
Yep.
but the school systems were heavily segregated and they couldn't get the resources that they needed.
Yeah. It was, in a way, it was similar to the lawsuit in the 80s that was filed in federal court against the Lowell public schools.
Yep.
Yeah, so this one was 5-4. But again, the people that decided in the majority said, no, this is clear. But obviously 4 people didn't.
Right.
So that's what's worrying.
Yeah.
In the current climate. Sort of what would happen if it sort of worked its way forward. Right now, I think at least a half a dozen states have said, no, you can't do this.
Mm-hmm.
You can't just decide the Constitution doesn't work.
Right.
That's not your job. But the Vice President, J.D. Vance, and other people in the Trump administration have basically said, no, well, we can kind of do what we want to do. And the president has also said, well, the courts make bad decisions.
Wow.
So I don't have to go by them.
Wow.
So that's pretty problematic in terms of, again, where this goes in the current in the climate that we find ourselves in. And so you could imagine if that maybe 1 or 2 other Supreme Court appointments are made in the next couple of years, that if this takes 2 or 3 years before it works its way through the various appeals courts, and maybe it does make it to the court, it would be in about 3 years, 3.5 years.
Oh my gosh. And
so conceivably there could be even more, there could actually be even a greater majority of Trump appointees on the court. And then you have to hope that people actually read the 14th Amendment the way historically it's been read since the early 1870s. But there's not a way of knowing.
Right. And then there's all of these mass firings in public agencies where bureaucrats who have worked for decades, who have that institutional knowledge, who are assisting these legislators in interpreting the Constitution, because some of it is a little bit vague and left vague for situations like this, to kind of plague on the American people. They're using their public distrust against us, against the American citizens, to continue to stoke these flames of, well, obviously we can't trust the media, we can't trust bureaucrats, we can't trust the courts now. And is the Constitution something we can trust?
Right.
And so I can see how the average American citizen who has no knowledge of these things would ignorantly buy into this rhetoric.
Yesterday, I was teaching all day, but then when I came home, I went online and started reading the newspapers, and the person that Donald Trump has put forward to be the Secretary of Education, Linda McMahon is her name. They were questioning her yesterday in the Senate, and they asked her about teaching Black history and whether, with what the president has said about diversity, equity, and inclusion and other things, would it in fact be that something like African American history as its own course couldn't be taught anymore? And she said she'd have to take a look.
Right.
And I thought, oh, okay, well, and I just found it interesting again, because when I was in college in the late 60s and early 70s, I was occupying buildings to get Black history taught. Right. And I'm thinking, okay, now, like at the end of my career, I might be occupying buildings again to have it not be kicked out.
Oh my God.
And I thought, wow, this is really, so the Supreme Court case, the most recent one was 1982. And it set aside an opinion that would keep undocumented, the children of undocumented parents out of school. And they said in that decision, there's no plausible distinction with respect to 14th Amendment quote unquote jurisdiction between resident aliens whose entry into the U.S. was lawful and residents whose entry was unlawful. And so if you're here and you're born here, you can't be deprived of that, right? And this was in the state of Texas, 1982. That was 5-4. There's a Georgetown law professor who I went looking to see what do people think, and he's an expert on the Supreme Court. And his quote was that 2 or maybe 3 justices on the current court would vote today to end birthright citizenship. And then he said, but all it takes is 5.
Oh my gosh.
And the court's composition may well change. Mm-hmm. And so that like I thought, okay, that's a rather chilling, that's a rather chilling quote.
Oh my gosh, Bob.
So.
And it doesn't seem like we have a lot of safeguards against political corruption right now. I keep thinking about, I just learned about merit-based versus patronage hiring in the public administration. And I feel like—
Let's see if we can make this stand up here for the last.
Our late President Jimmy Carter is rolling in his grave right now to see what is happening at all.
Yeah, I mean, civil service comes along in the early 20th century to prevent graft and corruption and patronage.
Yes.
And it starts out like in police and fire and things like that, where you want, which is really weird, right? Because the argument that gets made against diversity and inclusion is, well, then people are getting jobs they shouldn't have.
Right. Not that they've worked hard, just as hard, or even harder.
So let's get rid of the system that basically has qualified people, and let's throw it open to cronyism again.
Right.
And how's that going to work out? I mean, yeah, so the thing about this case is that's worrisome again is the Georgetown law attorney who says there's probably 3 people now that would vote to end birthright citizenship. Now, I don't know how they would interpret the language of the Constitution and all these cases, right? Because in theory, conservative justices have always been what are referred to as strict constructionists. You read the words the way the words were intended.
Right, right.
And you don't try to interpret them or whatever. So it'll be interesting to see what legal jujitsu they try to engage in to say, okay, well, we had this case in the 1870s, we have a case in the 1890s, we have a case in the 1980s. And in each instance, the judges say, no, it's clear. The Supreme Court justices say, you can't read this any other way. So what's the way they're going to read it? Because the only exclusion in the 14th Amendment, there is a little rider in there that says the only people not covered are people that are outside the jurisdiction of the United States. That always has been interpreted as ambassadors and people attached to embassies and things like that who claim diplomatic immunity. They can't be arrested, right? That, they could kill somebody in Central Park and go home, right? They can't be arrested, right? I mean, you always see that on law and order shows,
Right,
well, I'm a
yeah.
diplomat, you can't touch me,
Exactly.
right? And that was the exclusion, and that was the only exclusion in the law. Everybody else, if you're living here, you're under the aegis of the laws of the country. So if somehow they're going to, in 2025 or 2026, say people aren't, well, then that's freaking anarchy.
Yeah.
That means that would mean then that if an undocumented person committed a crime, by extension, you can't arrest them. They're not in your jurisdiction. It's a really weird, like, I'm half being serious and not, right? But that's what the distinction meant in the in 14th Amendment. When you close read it, that's the exception. People who are not under the rule of law of the United States, and that's diplomats.
Oh my gosh.
Who have what, again, we come to know these days as diplomatic immunity.
Oh,
That's not all these other people that are being discussed, nor are the people that are being discussed, getting here in the ways that people are imagining they were getting here, in terms of, sort of creating a story, that people are lining. I mean, the argument is that they're making is people line up at the border and wait until just before they feel their first labor pain, and then they jump across. And it's like, it's so stupid.
The whole thing, political polarization and corruption by a president who is a felon is calling people violent criminals and justifying this mass deportation and revoking of actual rights. And what does it say for the rest of us when they start repealing civil rights acts and other things that are going to impact people who are
Oh yeah, because if they do this, if they basically can reinterpret the 14th Amendment, then all bets are off.
Now, we don't want to scare our viewers.
No.
And we might want to light a fire under them and let them know, this is the time for us to band together.
Pay attention, please.
Pay attention. This is going to impact all of us. It's not just these people who you view as the other. That's what they want us to do. They want us to be separated. They want us to be divided. But have the prices of your eggs gone down? No, they have not.
Actually, now we don't have eggs.
So now we don't have eggs. FAFO, I won't tell you what that means. You can look it up. This has been History in Lowell. We will be back with more on the current constitutional crisis and how it relates in history, in the historical context. It's my buddy Bob. I'm Maritza. Thank you, Bob. Thank
As
you
always,
all for
a
tuning
pleasure.
in. Please, I implore you, band with your community, protect your fellow human. And remember, in Lowell, during the Fugitive Slave Act, not one formerly enslaved person was taken from here. Let's repeat that part of history and not the other parts. Thank you.